Welcome back. In this video, we're going to spend time talking about the different ways of selecting elements using JavaScript and the DOM. Before we talk about the actual selectors, we need to just review the document one more time. Remember that our entire DOM, all the objects, all the representations of our elements, all live inside of this document object. It's the top level object or the root node. So quickly, let's open up any browser window. I'm going to use Google, and let's try typing these 4 lines. So open up the console and type document.url, and it shows us the URL of the page that we're on. We can do document.links, and that's a whole list of every single link on the page, every single anchor tag. We could do document.body, and this is the entire body with every other element inside of it that lives in the body, and we can do document.head. So we've already seen this in the last few videos. The reason that I'm showing it to you again is that all of the selectors, all the methods we're going to learn, also live inside the document. So everything we learn about in this video is going to start with document.something. So I'll show you what those somethings are. There are 5 main methods we're going to talk about in this video. They're all built into the document. They all start with document dot. You can see them here. Get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by tag name, query selector, and query selector all. If you can think back to the video I did on adding methods to an object, where we could basically store a function as a value inside of an object, we had like cat space and dog space, and we had a speak method that we added into our dog space object. That's exactly what's happening here. These 5 methods have all been added in to the document object. So before we actually get started here, I want to show you the HTML that I'm going to use for demonstration purposes. It's a very, very simple page, just has a few elements. So our normal head, that's pretty much empty aside from a title, our body, and then inside the body, 2 H1s, one that says hello, another that says goodbye, and then 3 LIs inside of a UL. And those 3 LIs, list item 1, 2, and 3, are slightly different. The first one has an ID, highlight, and the last 2 have a class called bolded. So we're going to use that, the fact that some of them are H1, some of the elements are LIs, some have classes, one has an ID. We're going to use those different properties to select them in different ways in different combinations. So I'm using the same code here in the examples, and I'm drawing a green box, so you can see in the next few slides, a green box around whatever is selected. Okay, so let's get started with the first method, getElementById. So its name is a little bit self-explanatory. It takes in an ID name, and it's going to return the one element that matches that ID. Remember that an ID can only occur one time on a page. So here's an example. Document.getElementById highlight is going to select this LI that has ID highlight. So it selects the object, and then it returns it to us. I'll quickly show that in the console. So we'll open up the console, do a document.getElementById highlight, which is our ID name. Let's save it to a variable called tag, hit enter, and let's look at tag. And you can see it gives us the first LI that has ID equal to highlight. So we selected something by an ID. Again, it is showing it to us as if it's actually HTML, but the result of this is actually a JavaScript object. So we can do that console.dir again on tag, and this is actually what it looks like, all these properties. So this is just a nice shortcut for us to visually see what we selected, but in actuality, it's an object representation. All right, so that's all there is to getElementById. We call the method, we pass in a single string argument, the name of an ID that we want, and then it goes and finds the matching element that has the same ID, and it returns the object representation to us. The next one is getElementsByClassName. So its name tells you exactly what it does, just like getElementById, although this is slightly different, getElements, plural with an S, by class name. Remember, a class can occur as many times as we want on a page, so we pass in a string, like bolded, and that's going to return a list of all the elements on the page that have the matching class name, bolded. In this case, there's 2 of them. But if there were 10,000 elements on the page that had that class, we would get all 10,000 in a list. So let's go demonstrate this. So we'll write document.get elements by class name, and you can see we get this little autocomplete here, so we can select the one that we want, get elements by class name, and then the class name we want is bolded. And let's save it to a variable, tags, not tag, but tags, because we're going to get multiple tags back. If we look at what tags is, it's a list of two LIs, both with class equal to bolded. Technically, it's not an array. It's something called a node list, which is array-like. I like to think of it as a lightweight array. So it comes with some of the things that you would expect from an array, but some of the more advanced features are actually missing. So for instance, we can access elements like this using an index, tags 0. We can do tags.length, but we can't do a for each loop, tags.forEach. And if I just do this, it's going to tell me tags.forEach is not a function. So that's because there is no for each defined for these node lists. That's defined for arrays, and these aren't arrays. And just like with getElementById, by ID, it shows us this nice string representation, but behind the scenes, it's actually an object. So again, just to prove that to you, console.dir, and we do tags 0, and it actually is this big, complex, crazy object with tons of properties. Okay. So that's getElements by class name. It returns a list, not quite an array, and it contains every element on the page that matches the given class name that we provided. Next up, we have getElements by tag name. So this one works just like getElementById or getElements by class name, except it returns a list of elements that match a given tag name, like li or h1. So in this case, I'm running document.getElements by tag name li. That's going to return to me a list of the 3 LIs that exist on this page. So again, let's demonstrate that. var tags equals document.getElements by tag name. And let's do li first. And let's look at tags. And we get this list, also not quite an array, it's a node list that has 3 LIs. And I won't prove it to you this time. I won't do the console.dir. But these are objects. They're not just strings. They're not HTML. They're actually JavaScript objects with all those properties. So I can do the same thing for h1. So we'll select all h1s, and we look at tags, and we get 2 h1s in a list. It's not just limited to tags that we see inside the body. I could also do something like this, getElements by tag name body. And it is going to return to me a list with one element, the body, inside of it. Or I could also do it for the head, or the HTML element, or title, or whatever I want. But the important part is that it returns a list. Even if there's only one element, it still returns a list. So to select the body, we could do something like var body equals document.getElements by tag name body, and then just take the first item because there's only one item in that list. Then if we look at what body is, we get this giant object with the entire body. Okay, so that's getElements by tag name. Just to reiterate, you give it a tag name like li, it goes and finds all the elements that match it, it returns them all to you in a list, even if there's only one. So here I have another example, doing it with an h1. You can see that it selects the 2 h1s. Okay, so now we change gears a little bit. We no longer have a getElements or getElements by something syntax. This is called query selector. And query selector is a newer method that hasn't existed for all that long that really makes our lives a lot easier. So we actually can use it to do everything that we saw with getElementById, getElements by class name, getElements with tag name. We can replicate all of that with query selector. So what it does is it takes a CSS style selector. So a CSS style selector means just any of the selectors we would use inside of a CSS document. So in this example, I'm selecting something based off of the ID highlight. So I can't just write the word highlight like I did with getElementById. What I have to do is use the CSS syntax with the hash symbol or the octothorpe and then highlight. So this is how you select something with query selector if you want an ID, just like you would with CSS. And we get this first li with ID equal to highlight. Before I go over to the console and type this out, I'll show you we can do the same thing with a class name. var tag equals document.querySelector dot bolded, which is how we would select the bolded class using CSS. And what's important is that it actually only gives us the very first match. So even though there are two elements that have bolded as class, it only gives us the first one. And that's the point of querySelector. It always just returns one element. There is another method we'll see shortly that will return all elements that match. So querySelector can also take in a tag name like we have here, h1, and it returns the very first h1. So we can take CSS selectors that we write all the time in CSS, and we can use that syntax to select elements with querySelector. So I'll demonstrate that here. Let me clear this out. And let's select this first h1. So all I need to do, var h1 equals document.querySelector h1. And if we look at what h1 is, again, it's a nice string representation, but it's actually an object that represents this entire element. So next up, let's try selecting based off of an ID. So I'm just going to copy this line. Rather than h1, this will be an li. And rather than selecting the first h1, we'll select the first item that has the ID highlight. And of course, there's only one item because it's an ID. Of course, there's only one item that has this ID on a page. And we need this octothorpe here. Otherwise, it's going to look for a tag name called highlight, which doesn't exist in HTML. And if I hit enter and I look at li, I get that first li with list item 1, ID equals highlight. Lastly, let's do the same thing with a class. So I use the CSS selector dot bolded, which is how we select a class. And if we look at li, I get the second li with class equal bolded, list item 2. So there are other things that we can select. It's not just based off of a tag name or an ID or a class. Those are the most common, but we could do other things like this, which won't work on my page, but I could select all anchor tags inside of an li with a class of special. And this is a longer CSS selector, but it's valid in CSS. So all the anchor tags that have class special that are nested inside of an li, and that's totally valid. Again, I don't have this set up on my page, so if I hit enter, it's just going to give me null because it didn't find any matches. So as I mentioned, querySelector returns the first match and that's it. Sometimes that's useful. For instance, if you wanted to select the body, all I have to do is say querySelector body, and that gives me the body. Unlike when I did document.getElements by tag name body, that gave me a list, and then I had to ask for the first element. If I use querySelector, I'll just get the body right away. But the alternative is querySelector all. So it works exactly the same way. It takes a CSS selector, but it returns all matching elements. So in this case, I'm using document.querySelector all h1, and it returns both h1s. Or in this case, I'm using the class bolded. So CSS style, I need dot bolded, and that gives me both elements with the class equal bolded. So let's demonstrate that in the console. Let's select all LIs. So var LIs equals document.querySelector all li, and that will give me all of them. And I look at LIs, you can see it has 3 LIs. One last time, I know I'm a broken record. These are objects. They are not HTML. They are JavaScript objects that are constructed from this HTML. And if I do the same thing, but I do it instead with querySelector, and I hit enter, if I look at LIs, it's not a list, it's only one. So same thing if I did it for a class. So let's do it for the bolded class. We'll just call it bolded. And I do document.querySelector dot bolded. And I look at that. It's just the first item, list item 2. And if I do querySelector all, I then get a list with both of them in there. One point of confusion often for my students is that you can still use querySelector all even if there's only one element you're looking for. So you could do something like var li equals document.querySelector all of an ID, like highlight, and I look at li, and it's a list with one item. It's just pretty rare that you would do that, but it will still work if there's only one match. Alright, so we covered a lot of ground in this video. So let's go back to the beginning and do a really quick wrap up. So we started out by talking about how all of these methods are inside of the document object. We can select by ID with getElementById. We can select by class name with getElementsByClassName, and that returns a list, which isn't actually an array, it's called a node list. We can do the same thing, but using getElementsByTagName, which will also return a node list based off of an element type that we select by. Then we have querySelector, which is a jack of all trades. It returns the first element that matches a given CSS selector. So we can use it to do everything that getElementById, className, and tagname did. We can give it an ID like we do here, and a class like we do here, or an element name. And then there's querySelectorAll, which works the same way, except it returns a list, which is not an array, it's also a node list with all elements that match a given selector. Alright, so next up, I'm going to have you do a really quick exercise.